Let me begin by describing the opening stages of the Battle of Crecy from the viewpoint of one of the participants, a mercenary called Giovanni, in the vanguard of the French army. The crossbowmen from Genoa halted at the foot of the slope. The French knights reined in their horses behind the Italians, keeping apart from the mercenaries, who they despised. It had been a long, hot day, marching to encounter the English army, and at last they were in sight. Giovanni, one of the crossbowmen, could see a group of men on the hill, and to his surprise they were all dismounted. He had expected a mounted army, small perhaps, but very like the troops behind him, with their splendid steeds and banners. Instead, there were rows of men, whose armour did not show whether they were knights or not, and whose shields he could not make out at a distance. On either side of the group there were carts, as so often on a battlefield, and he assumed these were simply parked as a rough barrier to prevent an attack from the flank. An easy job, he thought, and it should soon be over, particularly as the English had been in the field for weeks and were said to be short of supplies. There would not be much booty to take home. The order was given to move forward. The ground was wet from recent rain, and men slipped and stumbled on the chalk. But the crossbowmen went on confidently, knowing that their weapons were the most powerful and feared on the battlefield. Knights might dislike them, but could not do without them. They could break up a defensive formation with their deadly fire, leaving the enemy at the mercy of a cavalry charge. As they closed on the English, they halted to draw their weapons. With the point of the bow on the ground, they put their foot into a kind of stirrup to steady it, as they wound the string back to give a massive tension before they loaded the bolt. But the slipperiness of the ground betrayed them, and it was some minutes before they could resume their march. To reload again was going to be very difficult, thought Giovanni. They were 100 yards or more short of the range at which they could attack the enemy, and they could now see that the carts were not simply on the flanks, but formed a great horseshoe round the whole army, with two arms that came out so that the attackers would be funneled into a narrow opening. The nearest carts were covered, which surprised Giovanni. But even as he puzzled over this, the covers were thrown back. Archers, using bows of a kind he had never seen before, like large hunting bows, stood up on the carts and began to fire. A hail of arrows, deadly at a much longer range than those of the crossbows, began to fall. The crossbowmen vainly fired back, only to see their bolts fall short. They reloaded, slipping on the chalk again, but the arrows were finding their mark, and the archers seemed to be able to keep up an almost continuous attack. Giovanni and his companions turned and fled, only to find that the French behind him, furious at the failure of the Genoese, were shouting "traitors" and trying to force them back into the action. Somehow he escaped, and when he turned to look back, he saw the French cavalry mown down in the trap which the English had set, their horses terrified by strange explosions which he had never heard before. Later, he learnt that these were from the first guns to be used on the battlefield in Europe. This brief account of one man's experience at Crecy is based on an extraordinary discovery, a long description of Edward III's victory over the French army at Crecy in 1346, which appears to draw on the experiences of one of the Genoese crossbowmen present at the battle, and which has only been published in the last few years. It is in a chronicle written in Rome within 10 years of the battle, and is probably based on one of the newsletters sent to the great Italian banking companies who financed the kings and merchants of Europe. The English annihilation of the formidable French army at Crecy sent shockwaves throughout Europe. It was the beginning of a series of victories. In Poitiers in 1356, where the French king was captured, Nájera in Spain in 1376, when a Franco-Spanish force was defeated, which marked the brief period of what I have called elsewhere the triumph of England. The French had suffered serious defeats before, in the Battle of the Golden Spurs against the Flemish at Courtrai in 1302, but they in turn had inflicted a similar defeat on the Flemish at Cassel in 1328. These were both battles of cavalry against infantry, with a mounted army of French knights attacking the pikemen from the Flemish towns. Crecy was a contest between two armies who on the face of it were of similar composition, knights supported by infantry. The English had no particular reputation as formidable fighters. Their victory over the Scots at Halidon Hill in 1333 was seen as a minor affair and scarcely reported outside the British Isles. The size of the armies at Crecy was very uneven, with the English severely outnumbered. But the English archers had never been in a major battle on the continent before, and the slaughter they inflicted on the French nobles was sensational news. Yet there is more to Crecy than just the use of a new weapon, the English longbow or great war bow. The tactics on the battlefield, particularly the disposition of the archers, have been the subject of endless debate. If we are to discover what really happened, we have to look at first at who might have been able to get any overall view of what was going on, and whether any particular details are mentioned prominently in most accounts of the battle. The French onslaught seems to have been disordered and impetuous, and therefore no French witness is likely to have been able to form a good judgment of what had happened. On the English side, Edward and his commanders would have known exactly how they had drawn up their troops, but the king's report home about the battle tells us almost nothing, except that there was a small area where most of the slaughter took place. The only other people who would have seen the English array clearly and at relatively close range were the Genoese crossbowmen, who advanced confidently, sure that their deadly weapons would rapidly deal with the dismounted English knights and their infantry, and it is with an imaginative reconstruction of what they saw that I began this talk. The striking aspect of the account in the Roman Chronicle is that it seems extremely well informed. We know that the attack by the crossbowmen failed, and another Italian chronicler attributes this to the crossbow strings being wet. But rain certainly did not stop crossbowmen elsewhere. The Roman Chronicle tells us that the rain had made the ground so slippery that the crossbowmen could not draw their bows, because when they put their foot in the stirrup, as they tensioned the string, it was impossible to hold the bow still. Now the land at Crecy is chalk, with a thin covering of topsoil, and like all chalk hills, is slick as silk after rain. I believe that this is one of those very rare moments when for once we can actually see one of the realities of medieval battle, a man-at-arms struggling with his weapon in adverse conditions. If this is the case, then we need to pay close attention to exactly what our chronicler tells us. King Edward quickly, in a small space of time, surrounded his host with good iron chains, with many iron stakes stuck in the ground. This surround was made in the shape of a horseshoe, closed all round except for a larger space behind, like a gateway, for the entrance and exit. Then he had deep ditches dug, where there were weak places. Then this chain was surrounded by carts which they had brought with them. They put one cart beside the next, with the shafts up in the air. It looked very like a good walled city, and the carts stood in a dense row. On the left flank, on the side towards Crecy, there was a little hill. On this was a piece of woodland. The corn was also standing, which had not been harvested. In that wood, and in the cornfield, he arranged 10,000 English archers, in hiding. Then he placed in each cart a barrel of arrows. He allocated 2 archers to each barrel. If the Roman chronicle is right, this is not a normal chivalric battle. He is telling us that Edward fought this battle from within a fortified laager of carts. Other accounts of the battle almost all refer to the presence of carts in the battle area. In particular, Giovanni Villani, the great Florentine chronicler, writing in the city which was at the centre of European banking of the time, describes the English defences as centred on a formation of carts. Taking all the versions into account, and the battle was very widely reported, we can reconstruct events as follows. Firstly, in the open chalk country of Crecy, an artificial defensive structure would be very valuable. The only natural defences mentioned by the chroniclers are a wood on the left flank and hedges. The contours of the landscape do present some features which were potentially useful. It is reasonably probable that Edward's position was above the modern village of Crecy, on the ridge which overlooks the valley of the River Mai, and he may well have placed his men so that the one obstacle on this hillside, the steep 16-foot-high bank of the Vallée des Clercs, forced the French to attack from a particular direction. No attacking army could cross this obstacle at speed. The English formation would probably have faced more or less due south, at the head of one of the valleys which run up to the ridge from the river. In such circumstances, Villani's declaration that they enclosed the army with carts, of which they had plenty, both of their own and from the country, rings true. This diagram shows a possible and highly tentative reconstruction of how this might have worked. The carts were probably drawn up in a roughly circular formation and may have been 2 or more deep, chained wheel to wheel. We know that this is how carts were used at a battle in Flanders in 1304, and in the next century in the Hussite wars in Bohemia. Edward had arrived at the battlefield 2 days before. He had more than enough time to ride over the ground, select a suitable position, and organise the creation of the array of carts. Furthermore, the evidence points to the availability of enough carts to create such a circle. The Roman chronicler asserts that the English army had 3,000 carts when it landed in France, but this figure is definitely too high. As a working figure, let us take a recent historian's estimate of a ratio of carts to men of 1 to 20, giving 700 carts for the English army of 14,000 men. The total area enclosed would then be around 11,500 square yards, certainly enough for the idea of the bulk of the English army inside a cart fortification. The Chronicle makes it clear that there was a substantial opening in the array, sufficient to allow the passage of numbers of men at arms. An entrance of 100 yards or so, as shown on this diagram, while open enough to invite the enemy to attempt an attack, would be a death trap allowing covering crossfire from archers on the carts. Importantly, this opening created the small area which Edward himself mentions in his report on the battle as the scene of most of the casualties. In previous battles involving archers against an attacking army, the English commanders had chosen sites with a valley which acted as a narrowing funnel. This meant that when the enemy approached, they were forced to break ranks and were rapidly transformed into a disordered mass. Edward deployed 2 wings of archers outside the circle. These were concealed, one in an unidentified wood and the other in tall standing corn. These were also concealed under the canvas of the carts, which would have been supported on wooden hoops, as in this famous illustration from the lateral salter of a travelling wagon. It would have been very difficult to attack these carts either on horseback or on foot. Added to this, there were primitive guns beneath the carts, which were probably better at causing panic among the horses than actually inflicting serious injuries. From the foot of the hill, as in the imaginary reconstruction with which I began, the approaching French forces would have seen a small army standing in an array of carts which looked not unlike the traditional method of guarding the rear of a defensive position. The carts would have served to conceal the true numbers within the ring and would have made the English army seem a tempting target. If we are to accept this reconstruction as a possibility, it would mean that the emphasis of Edward's military thinking went beyond the creation of an army which was well organised and formed of men which had fought together, in some cases for 2 decades. His thinking extended to the deployment of the latest technology in the shape of guns, and, as important as either of these factors, a genuine understanding of tactics and of the need for a specific type of site in order to make the most effective use of his archers. When he could not find the terrain that he needed, he was prepared to create by artificial means the necessary obstacles and constraints that would hinder the enemy. But there is another, very different reason behind Edward's remarkable military success at Crecy. To understand this success, we need to go back 20 years to the beginning of his reign, a reign which was equally remarkable because the traditional tensions between the king and his great lords were almost entirely absent. Most of the medieval rulers of England were engaged in an ongoing power struggle with the barons. For Edward, many of them were his close companions at court. They were linked to him by old friendship and particularly by a court culture which combined splendid display and tournaments. Tournaments in which Edward fought on equal terms with them as miles simplex, an ordinary knight. The core of this group were the men who in 1330 had helped Edward to overthrow Roger Mortimer, his de facto guardian and reputed lover of Edward's mother, Queen Isabella. Edward, then aged 20, was showing signs of resenting Mortimer's role. Mortimer tried to separate Edward from his friends by arresting them. Instead, his friends, led by William Montague, reacted to this threat by seizing Mortimer instead. "Better to eat the dog than be eaten by the dog," Montague said. Mortimer was tried for treason and executed. Isabella was sent into discreet exile to Castle Rising in Norfolk. Edward himself assumed the reins of power, and his friends were suitably rewarded. Edward was careful not to alienate those who had supported Mortimer and Isabella, and even Mortimer's son Roger was to become a member of the inner circle at court. But it was the conspirators who were closest to the king in the early years of his reign. Montague was Edward's particular friend, yet he never took advantage of his position, and Edward equally avoided showering favours on him, as his predecessors might have done. The chronicler Sir Thomas Gray, who served in Montague's household, tells us that immediately after Mortimer's death, at this time and for a long while after, the king was advised by William de Montague, who always encouraged him to virtue and honour, and to a love of arms, and they led a jolly young life, awaiting a greater season for greater affairs. This jolly young life consisted of festivals and tournaments. Court festivals were nothing new, but the king's participation in jousts and tournaments was a real change of style. Even Edward I, Edward III's grandfather, who had been an enthusiastic and successful jouster in his youth, virtually renounced tournaments after he became king. Under Edward III, we have records of 95 tournaments at which the king was definitely or probably present, 80 of which were in the years leading up to or immediately after the Crecy campaign. Some of these were festivals on the grandest scale. We have an eyewitness account of the tournament held in Cheapside in London in September 1331, less than a year after the coup against Mortimer. It was evidently designed to make the maximum impression on the watching citizens. The whole market area where they were to joust, between the conduit and the Cross of Queen Eleanor, was enclosed with stout timber and planks, and the whole pavement was strewn with sand. At the Bishop's Palace, where William Montague was the host, there was great plenty of provisions and many marvellous things. At the time for which the tournament was arranged, The kings, earls and barons, and all the knights in the kingdom gathered in London, and on the Sunday, the eve of St. Matthew the Apostle, William, who was captain of this solemn occasion, appeared with the king and other chosen knights in splendid clothing, with masks like Tartars. There came with them the same number of the most noble and beautiful ladies of the kingdom, all wearing red velvet tunics and caps of white camel's hair cloth. And each knight had on his right side a lady whom he led with a silver chain. The king had at his side the Lady Eleanor, his sister, a most beautiful girl. All of them, both knights and ladies, came at the hour of vespers, riding in pairs down the middle of Cheapside, preceded by more than 60 squires, all dressed in the same uniform. And they were followed by their jousting horses, covered with fine horsecloths, and thus, to the sound of trumpets and a variety of other instruments, they rode to their lodgings. On the following days, that is, Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday, the 16 knights, who were the keepers, defended themselves from early morning and to the evening against all comers, both native and foreign. Why should such a splendid event have been regarded as subversive by earlier kings, something to be avoided or banned, rather than celebrated? The answer lies in the origins of the sport. The tournament had begun as mock warfare, a kind of military exercise to keep knights in training in times of peace in the 11th century. It was almost as dangerous as war itself. But even worse, it could be the prelude to war. For a tournament, a large number of armed knights would assemble at a given place. If great lords were planning a rebellion, a tournament could be a convenient disguise for gathering troops for less peaceful purposes, and it was for this reason that tournaments were banned in England until 1194. Even then, Richard I permitted them only if they were specifically licensed by the king, and if they were held at one of 6 named sites in the whole of England. Because of the strict enforcement of the licensing system, the main records we have of tournaments before Edward III's reign are not of such events taking place, but of writs issued by the king to order the local sheriffs to prevent a tournament being held. Early tournaments were held in open country. The sites were described as between 2 towns, for example, Salisbury and Wilton. The combat could range over several square miles and involve groups of men in military formation. However, by Edward III's day, what had originally been private military exercises were now public events, and the sport changed accordingly. The teams involved had originally been a number of squadrons fighting against each other. These now became 2 much smaller teams, often as few as 12 knights. And a new style of fighting had developed in the 13th century, the individual joust. In this, 2 knights charged each other. After Edward III's time, a barrier was built down the tourneying area, known as the lists, to prevent accidental collisions. This was a better way of judging the skills of individual knights, as prowess in a general combat was difficult to determine. Jousts and tournaments had some value as practice for combat in a real war. However, the strong personal bonds which were forged between Edward and the men who led his armies when they fought in tournaments were far more important than any improvement in skill with weapons. Most of the commanders of his army figure in the tournaments. For a tournament at Dunstable in 1342, held on the occasion of the betrothal of Edward's son Lionel, we have the names of 134 knights. Of these, 89 can be identified as being at the Battle of Crecy 4 years later, and it is possible that at least some of the remainder were also on the campaign. This tight-knit group represented the core of an English army remarkable for its cohesiveness and the quality of its leadership. The system of recruitment used from 1342 onwards gave it a strong and resilient structure, because the knights, bannerets and lords selected their own men, who formed their retinue. These men often fought under the same leader in several campaigns. This was particularly true of the men-at-arms and foot soldiers, and the bonds within the retinue were reinforced by the fact that they were often recruited from the knights' own lands. The lords' retinues, in turn, were made up of a number of knights with their individual retinues, and loyalty to lord and to locality was important at this level too. It was harder to forge such links between the king, as feudal lord of all England, and the great lords of the land, and this was exactly where the common enthusiasm for tournaments was so valuable. The Duke of Wellington's famous remark that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton may be apocryphal, but it would be fair to say that the extraordinary victories of Edward's reign were indeed won on the tournament fields of England. The victory at Crecy was commemorated each year at Windsor by the men who had been closest to Edward III and his son the Black Prince during the battle. The Company of the Garter was the religious confraternity founded by Edward III for this purpose in 1348, which then became a chivalric order of knighthood after Henry V's victory at Agincourt in 1415.